One of the claims you'll hear every once in a while is a claim that I made myself at one point in my life, that Jesus never existed, that he was just some type of made up character, and Christianity was just built on myths and legends. So, is there actually any historical evidence that Jesus existed, or was Christianity just a story that grew over time? Hey guys, welcome to Under Investigation. My name's Joel, and before we jump into any evidence, I just wanted to make one thing clear. Today, we're not trying to answer whether Christianity is true. We're not trying to answer whether the Bible is inspired. There's only one thing on our mind today, and that's if Jesus is an actual historical figure, if he actually existed. Because if the answer is no, we could just pack our bags and we could just leave, right? There's no reason to investigate anything else. Now, if the answer is yes, that's going to open a door to a lot of other questions. So let's start where every investigation should start, with the evidence. All right, before we can answer if Jesus existed, we got to figure out how the historians actually answer this question themselves. Because ancient history doesn't work the way a lot of people think it does. Historians aren't asking, can we prove this with absolute certainty? That's not how ancient history works. Instead, what they're doing is they're asking a question. What is the best explanation based on the evidence that survived? Because you got to think about it. We don't have any video of Julius Caesar. We don't have any photographs of Socrates. We don't have any of the original copies of most ancient documents. That's the reality of studying the ancient world. So what kind of evidence are historians actually looking for? They're asking questions like, how early are the sources? Do multiple independent sources talk about the same person? Do those sources fit what we already know about Jesus? Do any of the writers outside of that person's own followers mention them? Those are some of the questions historians ask, whether they're investigating Jesus, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or anybody else from the ancient world. There's just one more thing that's really important. A lot of people assume that if someone has a bias, you should just throw away anything they wrote. Historians don't do that. Almost every ancient writer had a point of view. The real question isn't, did they have beliefs? The question is, can we still recover reliable historical information from what they wrote? That's how historians investigate the ancient world. And it's the same standard we're going to use throughout this investigation. Now that we understand how historians investigate the ancient world, we got to ask a simple question. What do historians actually conclude about Jesus? Because if the historical evidence was weak, you'd probably expect historians to be all over the place. But that's not what we're going to be finding. One of the things that surprised me the most when I started researching this is that this really isn't much of a debate among professional historians. Christians, Jews, agnostic, atheist historians, they all overwhelmingly agree that Jesus was a real historical person. That doesn't mean that they all agree about who Jesus was. And that's not even what we're talking about today. We're only talking about if he existed, because they definitely didn't agree who he was. Some believe he was God, some think he was just a teacher, some reject Christianity completely. But when it comes to one question, did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? The overwhelming consensus is yes. So you got to pay attention to something very important here. None of those conclusions require someone to believe in Christianity. You don't have to believe Christianity is true to believe and to know that Jesus actually existed, the Jesus of the Bible, right? They're just simply historical conclusions that most historians have reached after looking at the evidence. So the real question isn't, do historians think Jesus exists? The real question is why? What evidence convinced them that he existed? The historical case for Jesus doesn't depend on one source. It comes from multiple independent lines of evidence. Paul's letters, the Gospels, non-Christian historians, and the historical settings surrounding all of it. Over the next few chapters, we're going to be investigating each one. We'll ask why the historians consider it reliable. We'll look at what it actually says, and we'll be careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. So let's start with the earliest evidence we have. All right, so before we can get into what Paul actually says, we really got to figure out, why should we even trust the letters in the first place? Because I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Let's look at why the historians consider them such an important source. First, who is Paul? Paul wasn't one of Jesus' 12 disciples. He actually started opposing the Christian movement. Then something changed. He became one of Christianity's earliest missionaries, traveled through the Roman Empire, and wrote letters to churches that he either started or helped. Those letters weren't written as biographies of Jesus. They were actually real letters written to real people about real situations they were dealing with. And well, that's one of the reasons historians find them valuable, because they're just not written, they're not written centuries later. They're being written the very first generation of Christianity. Now, here's the other question. How do historians know Paul's letters actually come from that time? They don't just guess. They compare the people, places, and rulers and historical evidence Paul mentions with the other ancient sources that can be debated independently. Because of that, scholars might disagree on the exact year of one of his letters, but there's broad agreement that Paul's genuine letters were written within a few decades of Jesus' death. And by the standard of ancient history, that's super early. And now take a look at what we've actually established so far. We haven't shown anything about Christianity being true. We haven't shown Jesus rising from the dead. All right. All we've established is that historians have a good historical reason for treating Paul's letters as an early and valuable source. Now that we've looked at why historians trust the source, let's look at what the source actually says. Now let's look at one of Paul's letters in the Bible, the book of Galatians, chapter 1, verse 18 to 19. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. First, Cephas is the name of Peter. Cephas means rock in Aramaic. So it's Peter's name in Aramaic. And then James is Jesus's brother. And so he's saying after 3 years, he went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. He went to visit him. So he's not talking about somebody that he heard from another person centuries before or anything like that. He actually knew Peter. He actually knew James. He's actually talking to these people. So this is huge. Paul personally knew men who were directly connected to Jesus. That puts Paul extremely close to the evidence that he's writing about. And that's exactly the kind of historical evidence that historians are looking for. Now, we've already established that Paul knew Peter and James, right? But Paul gives us another letter that brings us even closer to the events of Jesus. It's going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8. Let's go there. It says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ Jesus died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." We've got to break this down a little bit. This is his first letter to the church of Corinth. In the beginning, he says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." He is delivering to the church of Corinth information that he also received. This is not something that he's making up. This is something that he received and he's passing along to the church of Corinth. And so why does this matter? I mean, this is really just stating that there was information that was circulating before Paul even started writing all these things. The information was that Jesus lived and that he died and that he rose again. That's why historians are paying so much attention to this passage, because this is a tradition that's already circulating before Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. And so whether those actually happened, that's a separate investigation. But the belief itself is undeniably early. And historically, that's a really important piece of evidence. So now these two letters that we just went over, it establishes two things: that Paul personally knew early leaders in the Christian movement, and second, that he preserves a tradition that most historians agree goes back to the earliest years of Christianity. So now, what about the Gospels? Do historians actually use them as historical sources? A lot of people say, why do historians look at the four Gospels? Shouldn't they be disqualified because they're religious documents? But historians use all kinds of ancient sources: religious writings, political writings, government, personal letters, propaganda, biographies. So what historians ask is, what historical information can we reasonably recover from it? It doesn't mean historians are going to accept everything in the Gospels without asking questions. They're going to investigate it just like they investigate any other ancient source. They're going to ask when they were written. Did they preserve any early traditions? Do multiple sources agree? Do they fit what we know about the first century Judea? Those are historical questions, and that's exactly how we're going to be approaching them. So the first thing to notice is that in the Gospels, they don't describe Jesus as some mythical figure who lived in some made-up place in some unknown point in history, right? They're talking about him being in specific historical settings, like historical places. So, according to the Gospels, Jesus lived in first century Judea and Galilee, regions that were under Roman rule. And his life and ministry happened in real places like Nazareth, Capernaum, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. These aren't just legendary locations, they're real places that historians and archaeologists know well. The Gospels also place Jesus alongside real historical figures like John the Baptist, Pontius Pilate, Herod, the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Those weren't mythical people, they're independently known from ancient history. So, what the Gospels do is they place Jesus around real people, real places during a specific period of time in history. And that's exactly the kind of historical information historians are looking for. So I'm sure a lot of you are asking this question. Like we've looked at historical evidence from Christian sources. But now, are there any non-Christian historians mentioning Jesus? And the answer is yes. One of the most important is going to be the Jewish historian named Josephus. Josephus was born around 37 AD, so he was born just a few years after the time of Jesus. Later, he wrote a massive history of the Jewish people called Antiquities of the Jews, which was completed around AD 93 or 94. Today, Josephus is one of the most important sources we have in understanding first century Judea, not just Christianity, but the entire political, religious, and cultural world Jesus lived in. Josephus wasn't a Christian. He spent his life writing history from a Jewish perspective. And that's important because historians aren't looking for people who agree with Christianity. They're looking for independent sources that can help us understand what actually happened. So let's be fair, Josephus isn't a perfect source. No ancient historian is. He had his own opinions, his own biases, just like every other ancient writer. But historians don't throw out ancient sources just because the author had a point of view, just like we don't throw away the Gospels just because they're Christian sources. Instead, they ask, can we still recover reliable historical information from what they wrote? When it comes to Josephus, the answer is yes. And that's why historians continue to use his writings today. Now that we've looked at why historians trust Josephus, let's see what he actually said about Jesus. Josephus mentions Jesus in two different places, but one of the passages is a little bit more debated than the other. So we got to look at them separately. So the first passage is the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18. Today, most historians agree that the passage was probably edited by later Christians, and we're about to find out why. Let me show you. All right, so this is Antiquity of the Jews, Book 18. This is going to be chapter 3, and we're scrolling down to section 3 right here. This is what it says. Just remember, this is what historians believe that might be edited by Christian scribes, so we can't really take it fully, right? It says, now that was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. Now remember, we're talking about a Jewish man here. This is Josephus, a Jewish man. He's not Christian. So this is why they're thinking a Christian scribe edited this, because he says stuff like he was the Christ. You know, he is the Christ. And he's saying Jesus, if it was lawful to call him a man. So he's pretty much calling him God. And that's not something someone who is not a Christian, who is a Jew, would be saying. So this is why they believe that it's likely that a Christian scribe edited this. But the other one is Antiquity of the Jews, book 20. It's going to be chapter 9. So let's go to that one. And so right here, we're going to scroll up. I just want to show chapter 9. And we scroll down here. And it says, so he assembled a Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned, right? And so right here, you can see the difference on how he talks about Jesus, right? Because in the first one, he said, who is the Christ? And he said, if it would be lawful to even call him a man. And now this one contrasts to this. It says Jesus, who was called the Christ. He's not saying that Jesus is the Christ. He said he was called the Christ. And that's why people don't really deny this one as much as the other one. But nevertheless, Josephus is talking about a man named Jesus, which is going back towards the Bible. So that doesn't mean the whole passage was fake on the Antiquities, book 18, right? It just means that the majority of the historians believe that Josephus originally wrote something about Jesus, but later copyists added a few Christian sounding phrases. Historians use that passage carefully. Now, the second one that we went over, which is the Antiquities of the Jews, book 20, chapter 9, that one, Josephus talks about the execution of a man named James, and he identifies him as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. And remember, and when we talked about Paul knowing Peter and James in Galatians earlier, right? So this is James, the brother of Jesus, that they're talking about here. So, unlike the first passage, this reference is widely accepted by historians as authentic. So Josephus wasn't trying to defend Christianity, but what he does is give us an independent Jewish testimony that Jesus was known as a real historical person and that James was widely recognized as his brother. And that lines up really well with the evidence we've already looked at. So now we've seen an early Christian source and an independent Jewish source. So what about the Romans? Did any Romans historians mention Jesus? One of the most respected Roman historians was a man named Tacitus. But before we look at what he wrote, let's ask the same question we asked with all the other sources. Why should we trust them? Tacitus was born around about 116 AD. He wrote a history called the Annals. It covers the reigns of several Roman emperors. And today, historians regularly use Tacitus because he was one of the Romans' most respected historians and paid close attention to the political events of historical details, right? He had plenty of negative views about Christianity. And that actually makes the testimony a little bit better because he wasn't Christian. He wasn't trying to convince anybody to be Christian or anything like that. He had no reason to exaggerate these Christian claims. So all he was doing was recording historical events. Now, it doesn't mean everything Tacitus wrote is automatically correct, but historians evaluate him the same way they evaluate every ancient source. They compare the writings with other evidence. They ask where his information came from, and they recognize both strengths. And they recognize both his strengths and his limitations. Even so, Tacitus remains one of the most important Roman historians from the ancient world. So now that we looked why historians trust Tacitus, let's see what he actually wrote. All right, so now we have the Annals, book 15, chapter 44 right here. Let's just read this part right here. We're going to start right here. All right. So therefore, to scotch the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinement of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, has undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. So Tacitus is talking about the great fire of Rome, and the emperor Nero blamed Christians for it. So you could tell he's not talking very nicely about it, right? So what Tacitus is actually doing here is he's giving us an independent Roman testimony that Jesus was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, and that the Christian movement had spread from Judea all the way to Rome. So this lines up with what we've already seen from the Christian and the Jewish sources. And by this point, we've already seen three different perspectives: the Christian, Jewish, and Roman. So before we move on, it's worth mentioning that these aren't the only ancient sources connected to the investigation. There's other non-Christian writers. We don't need to go through each one in detail for today's investigation because the reason we've focused on Paul, the Gospels, Josephus, and Tacitus is because they're generally considered the strongest and most significant historical sources for answering today's question. So taken together, they provide multiple independent lines of evidence pointing to the same historical conclusion. So let's look at a few of the most common arguments people make against Jesus' historical existence. The claim is Jesus never existed and that he was invented by early Christians. So this view is called mythicism. So according to this theory, Jesus wasn't a real historical person. He was created as a legendary figure by the early Christian movement. And today, somehow that view still exists, but there's a very small minority position among professional historians. Why? Because the evidence is simply too early and too widespread. We have Paul's letters, the Gospels, Josephus, Tacitus, and several additional ancient references. Taken together, it's very difficult to explain the beginning of Christianity if Jesus never existed. The other claim is that there's no Roman records of Jesus. And at first, this sounds like a strong objection, but it assumes we'd expect Roman government records to survive for every person who lived in the first century. That's just not how ancient history works. So very few administrative records from Roman Judea have survived, and Jesus wasn't a Roman emperor. He wasn't a governor. He wasn't a military commander. From Rome's perspective, he was a Jewish teacher living in a distant province. So the lack of surviving governmental records really isn't unusual. It's actually what historians would expect. And the next claim is Josephus was changed by Christians. So the objection, we already went through some of this, right? But this objection is partially true, right? Most historians agree that one of Josephus' references to Jesus was edited by later Christian scribes. But that doesn't mean everything Josephus wrote about Jesus is unreliable. As we saw earlier, his reference to James, the brother of Jesus, is widely accepted as authentic. So the conclusion is really that historians separate the disputed passage from the passage that is broadly accepted. That's exactly how historical evidence is supposed to work. The next objection is Tacitus only repeated what Christians believed. Some scholars have suggested Tacitus may have learned about Jesus from Christians instead of the Roman record. That's possible. The truth is, we simply don't know exactly where Tacitus got all this information. But that's different from saying this testimony has no historical value. Tacitus was openly hostile towards Christianity. He wasn't trying to defend it, and regardless of where he got the information, he still treated Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate as a historical event. So that's one of the reasons historians continue to consider his testimony valuable. Reasonable people can debate individual sources. That's part of historical investigation. But when multiple independent sources from different backgrounds all begin pointing in the same direction, the historical case becomes much stronger. And that's exactly what we've seen throughout this investigation. All right, guys, so we've reached the end of this investigation. So let's back up and look at the evidence as a whole. We started with one simple historical question. Did Jesus actually exist? We're not talking about if he was God. We didn't talk about if he performed miracles or did he rise from the dead. Those are just separate investigations, right? But today's question is only, did Jesus exist as a real historical person? And during this investigation, I mean, we looked at early Christian sources, the Gospels, we looked at independent Jewish testimony, Roman testimony, and we looked at the strongest objections people raised against all of it. The historical evidence supports the conclusion that Jesus existed as a real first century Jewish man. And based on the evidence we looked at, I think the conclusion is clear. Jesus existed. Not because one source says he did, but because multiple independent lines of evidence all point to the same conclusion. That doesn't end the investigation. That actually begins the investigation, because once we've established that Jesus really lived, the next question becomes even more important. Who was he?